Of all the principles and all the lessons that Star Wars has for us on how to live, conquering fear and living with uncertainty is the most important of all of them.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to the show. I've got a great guest with me here today. One of my good friends who I've worked with for years now, Stephen Kent. He's the host of Right Now on Rightly from Al Jazeera and author of the new book, How the Force Can Fix the World, Lessons on Life, Liberty, and Happiness from a Galaxy Far, Far Away. Stephen, thanks so much for coming on.
Brad, very nice to see you.
Yeah, I know. I've been meaning to have you on for some time now. The book is officially available for pre-order. Look, guys, stop what you're doing. Go to the show notes, click the link, pre-order the book. I don't recommend books very often, but this is one you must read. It has my full endorsement. But we are going to talk about it today, but go ahead and pre-order it now or at the end of the episode. Stephen, I guess just to get going, I know you've been a lifelong Star Wars fan. I know you're a political commentator and writer. How did you get the idea to write a book about the intersection of the two?
Well, I have a podcast, which was my original project, my passion project for Star Wars and politics, called the Beltway Banthas Politics Podcast. And this is a project I started during the 2015 Republican presidential primaries because I was just watching the news, right? And just a lot of times you'll see commentators make little jokes about like, oh, this person's gone to the dark side. Oh, Marco Rubio is no longer the apprentice. He's become the master, you know, and they were talking about his clashes with Jeb Bush on the debate stages. And I was just like, Star Wars and politics are always doing this. They always find ways to mesh. One of my favorite commentators on MSNBC talked about Trump's administration and his cabinet as being like the cantina in Mos Eisley. And so I did the podcast Beltway Banthas to start looking at how people on the left and the right share less and less and less these days. But Star Wars continues to be this common ground, this watering hole where a lot of people come together over love of a thing and don't want to argue about it and tear each other apart over it. This is obviously not 100% true all the time. The world has changed a lot, particularly since The Last Jedi came out. And we can talk a little bit about how Star Wars fandom is fractured. But Star Wars remains a widely popular franchise that brings together a lot of different people.
And that's one of the things that interests me, because your book is about the big picture themes to take away from Star Wars that can fix some of the problems breaking us apart as a society. But Star Wars, and I'm just a casual fan, I've seen most of the movies, I'm not a diehard like you or millions of people, right? But it has never seemed to me on the face like a political series of movies or work of art. Mm-hmm. But obviously there are some themes there. So how political exactly is Star Wars?
Well, Star Wars is quite political, and I just don't think that you can get away from it just given its revolutionary nature. You are talking about the original trilogy, 1977 to 1983, put together by sort of like liberal hippie George Lucas, and it is a commentary about where the United States was at that time, imperialism, rising up against tyranny, the little people versus the big guys. Like, this is obviously by its nature a political story because we're talking about regime change and fighting authoritarianism. Now, people on the right tend to look at this and go like, well, it's the hero's journey. It's just about, growing up. Because when liberals in particular say like a thing is political, the right kind of always takes that as like, well, then it's against us. Like it's like defiling the sacred. And I've just never felt that way as a conservative or a libertarian myself. Star Wars political tradition continues very strongly with the prequels. It's a trilogy about the creation of Darth Vader and the fall of a republic and the birth of an empire. It models in many ways the decline of Rome, and it is meant to warn people in the early 2000s, in the middle of the Bush administration, about what happens when you give your government a blank check to fight every fear that you have in the world and uncertainty. It's there. You can't get away from it. But what the politics of those movies mean I think is actually fully up for debate, and neither side, the left nor right, have, I think, a claim to the moral high ground when it comes to these films.
Yeah, and I guess the reason it doesn't seem overtly political is because you have to think about it, right? And a lot of people just turn on the screen and then they zone out.
That's the good stuff, Brad. Like that's politics in movies that's good. It's not smacking you in the face. Like every line that the characters say, it's like obviously like one of Hillary Clinton's slogans. There was in The Handmaid's Tale, there was in one of the most recent seasons, and don't ask me why I'm watching this, but I did. There's a line where one of the characters looks like right at one of their colleagues, and they go like, "God bless the squad," and they were referring to an actual squad of characters in the show, but in the marketing for the television show, you knew what they were winking at. Like they were winking at their like woke progressive fans, and they put a line in the movie of "bless the squad" just to like make people do this. And that's when politics is crappy in your entertainment.
But the big picture stuff that you have to really think about is where your book focuses. And so just talk about the core principles that you take away from the Star Wars franchise in terms of things we can take away about our lives and about society.
Yeah, so this book seeks to kind of step back from a lot of the political polarization that we struggle with in our society, and not talk about the Star Wars story sort of like, I don't know, like taking its political lessons and being like, well, Star Wars is about the rise of a populist dictator and the decline of a democracy. Therefore, don't vote for populists. That to me is almost like a little bit too ham-handed and trying to use Star Wars for your own political ends. So I made a conscious effort to be like, what are these movies saying that is unobjectionable and is not political by nature? And those virtues that stood out to me that permeate the Star Wars story are that of empathy, humility, rejecting fear, living in hope, embracing the virtue of redemption, believing in balance, and free will. So these are the principles that I based the entire book around. Every chapter in the book, How the Force Can Fix the World, is an exploration of what Star Wars says about empathy and why empathy is part of the Star Wars story, what Star Wars says about redemption. And then I look at some of the areas in our own culture where redemption is absolutely in decline and very much needed. And I really go out of my way to not take Star Wars, twist it, and be like, Star Wars is against cancel culture. Star Wars doesn't talk about cancel culture, but its values you can apply to other things that are in our political discourse.
Yeah, I like that you're not just taking it and kind of melding it into a partisan hammer to hit Democrats with.
Yeah, and just like a fun fact for you, Brad, and for your audience, like you can write a Star Wars nonfiction book, and something that I learned by talking to lawyers about this stuff is like Disney and Lucasfilm, they will not like stop people from writing books like this as long as you're not like twisting the content of the thing that they own. And that's kind of like the line that's really important to walk with a book like this, is not to take liberties with its message. And I just believe very strongly that when you take Star Wars at face value, it does not make the partisan, incredibly polarizing combatants on the left and right happy. I live on Star Wars Twitter all the time, and far right Twitter and far left Twitter are always bickering about Star Wars, and it's because they don't actually like what it really says. They want it to change to be what they believe. Star Wars has never been like that.
But maybe to break into some of these values in a tangible way for people, maybe we could just start with some of the most famous storylines. I always think of Anakin Skywalker, and not just because the actor who plays him is incredibly attractive. Tell us about Anakin and what his path and his storyline tells us about the values that you mentioned.
Well, the story of Anakin is that of the road to hell being paved with good intentions. It's a story of a person who cannot let go of uncertainty, cannot abide with fear and things being unpredictable. And this is what defines the Star Wars story. There is two things that Anakin encounters in his life that I think define how we should think about the principle of rejecting fear. The first instance is when Anakin is a young boy and leaves Tatooine, and his mother can tell he's afraid. And Anakin says to his mom, I don't want things to change. And she takes a knee and she looks at him lovingly and she says, Anakin, you can't stop the change any more than you can stop the sun from setting. And he listens and then he walks away. He does not live in that advice. He does not live in that wisdom. And it brings him incredible pain and suffering throughout his life. You know, he has dreams that his mom is dying and he goes all out of his way to try to stop it, knowing that he cannot control life and death. And he fails, she dies. And then Anakin sets off for the next two movies to control life and death itself. And it drives him into being the monster known as Darth Vader. When he first meets Yoda in episode 1, he's also told that he is afraid. They can sense it on him. They can smell it on him like Jedi do. And Yoda says, fear is a path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. My contention in this book, How the Force Can Fix the World, is that we are on this path. My question to the audience that I pose throughout the book is, where in the sequence do you think we are? I think we're past fear leading to anger. I think we are past anger leading to a mass outbreak of hatred. I just am afraid to say that we are at the suffering point yet. And I worry about where we could go from here.
Yeah, that's one of the quotes that stood out to me from your book materials. My pre-ordered copy isn't here yet, which I expect you to sign, but I did have the pleasure of reviewing the sample chapters. But fear is one of these values that you talk about, and it seems so relevant and so poignant to me because we're living in a world dominated by fear, a media where, and I don't really not count myself in this. Obviously, this applies to me too. Media is, if it bleeds, it leads, right? The thing that will scare you, the thing that could hurt you, this thing could affect
the cicadas.
Right. This is how it's how you attract listeners and viewers and politicians. It's how you garner votes. The Democrats are radical Marxists who will destroy everything. The Republicans hate democracy. I mean, I think of COVID and I think of fear. Yeah. People vastly overestimate, you look at polling, the actual risks of COVID, the actual death rates, the actual hospitalization rates. Mm-hmm. I mean, you see, they just totally detached from the science. You see a healthy 20-something-year-old woman jogging alone in the street with an N95 on. Right.
And it's not even it's like about fear. It's also just about control. It is about this desire to control everything that happens in your life. And that's fine. Like, we get vaccines to have more control over life and death, and our health. Like, that matters to us. But there's this thing about like a pandemic and this coronavirus thing, which, you know, is thankfully in the rearview mirror. There is only so much that you can do. And running outside in the heat when you need to be breathing clearly, wearing 2 masks because you are afraid of the possibility that somebody who might run by you will cough in your face. Like, you are trying to control. And I'm not saying you should be risky. There's not a connection between like courage and being reckless, but you can't control everything. And like, that is what that whole situation is about. Double masking is embarrassing.
Double masking while vaccinated. But tell us how fear. Which parts of the Star Wars storylines most closely tie into this theme?
Well, all of Star Wars, every single movie and all 3 trilogies are stories about fear and how characters learn to come to grips with them. Anakin's story in the first 3 films is his fear, his unwillingness to live with uncertainty, and then what he is willing to give up and destroy in the name of having control. So this is how the Empire rises. This is the fall of Anakin Skywalker. Luke Skywalker, his main challenge is also very similar. So in The Empire Strikes Back, when he is being trained by Yoda on Dagobah, he experiences, just like his father before him, a vision of his friends suffering. And he believes that he needs to take action, leave his training, and fly out to them and stop whatever is about to happen from happening. Yoda tells him, hard to see the future is, always in motion it is. It could be deceiving you. Your fears can project these visions into your head. You can also make these things happen simply by pushing this timeline forward like you are. Luke doesn't listen. He runs to Cloud City. He fights Darth Vader before he's ready, and he loses a hand. And it didn't stop Han Solo from being tortured, captured, and put in carbonite. The third trilogy is about people who are afraid of their own shadow. Luke Skywalker loses faith in himself as a teacher. Kylo Ren is afraid of his own legacy and of not being as powerful as people who are in his family, Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader. And then you also have Rey, when she is eventually faced with the fact that she is a Palpatine, which is an interesting plot twist. She's afraid of her own shadow and afraid of who she could become, and she has to overcome that in The Rise of Skywalker. So I really do believe that of all the principles and all the lessons that Star Wars has for us on how to live, conquering fear and living with uncertainty is the most important of all of them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess one thing I'm curious about, how do you analyze, in connection to these values, the Jedi and the Force and kind of that, because it has this kind of simplistic narrative of good guys versus bad guys, but I feel like Star Wars is more complicated than that.
It's absolutely more complicated than that. So the Jedi are an example. I always struggle with like the right analogy exactly, but they are supposed to be monks and guardians of the light side of the Force. Their commitment is supposed to be to protecting the ways of the light, living in sort of abstinence and temperance, and becoming one with the ways of the light. And instead, when Anakin Skywalker turns to the dark and he's facing Obi-Wan on Mustafar, and Obi-Wan shouts out to him, that like they're supposed to defend democracy and the Republic. His loyalty is to the Republic, to democracy. And I always watch that and I step back from it and go, your loyalty is to the Republic and to democracy? You're a Jedi monk. Why is your loyalty to the Republic regime and maintaining this particular government across the galaxy? And you realize that it is because the Jedi do not want to face their dark side counterparts, the Sith, and they do not want to not have a say in the affairs of the galaxy. They think that the order of the galaxy is best influenced by them rather than them stepping aside from galactic affairs. And it leads them down the road of being control freaks, just like the rest of the people in Star Wars who fall from grace. The Jedi's unwillingness to let the galaxy go its own way and to focus on themselves rather than control others is a huge part of their downfall. One of the things that I focus on in the book, because I thought COVID-19 was a little bit too raw to talk about in the fear chapter in particular, I was like, what's an area in which like we really have a widespread bad relationship to paranoia and fear? And I actually decided to go the route of free range parenting and letting your kids play outside. And most of the chapter on fear. I talk a little bit about COVID-19. I talk about risk assessment, the likelihood that you're going to get attacked by a shark or mauled by a bear when you're out in the wilderness. But then I spend some time really looking at how the war on terror, the crime wave of the 90s, the serial killer wave of the 70s and 80s has created this world where in the state of Maryland, two parents almost had their children taken away from them for allowing them to walk just a few blocks down the road to a public park on their own without adult supervision in their nice, safe neighborhood. There is now a need nationwide for laws to protect parents from the government taking their children away, for letting them play outside unsupervised. These are choices that we make. These are public policy decisions that we make. And it is evidence that I think paranoia, statistics, and fear are just like out of control in our own minds and in the media. So this book, again, and I'm sorry for the long answer here, it's like it looks at Star Wars and what Star Wars has to say about stuff. It looks at our politics and what's broken. But at the end of the day, it's like a little bit of a self-help book. It's like, this is how living a different way would make you a better person, happier, less stressed, and then, I hope make your politics a little bit more sane.
Yeah, well, and I'm curious to kind of break down that part that you just mentioned, because some of these themes are about systems of government and policy and societal approaches and culture, but it's also got a little bit of 12 rules for life vibe about it, right? Like you can implement these in your own life. Tell people what the takeaway is, and obviously they need to read the book to get the whole thing, but give people a sneak peek of what they could do from their life, drawing on these principles and these lessons to make a difference.
Yeah, so the chapter on fear is a good example. So at the end of every chapter, I actually do go out of my way to include bullet points of saying, like, it's hard to live without fear. That's not natural. Like, it's not natural. Like, humankind has evolved and risen to be the dominant species on this planet because of our paranoias and fears. We build the world so that it keeps us safe. That's why we are what we are. So I try to be realistic about that, but zoom in on a couple of ways you can start controlling some of these things in your life. Not controlling, but implementing these things in your life. So improving your levels of empathy, building your sense of humility, and living with a little bit less fear. There's a mindfulness coach who does practice called Elisa Boxer. And Elisa's mindfulness meditations that she gives for like millions of dollars to high-paying clients, big podcaster too, she asks her clients to breathe in, breathe out, and if they are feeling anxious, name the thing that is making them anxious. And the point of this practice is because a lot of times we project the things that we think we're afraid of onto the wrong things, and we have to really pause and be mindful of what is actually making us afraid. And in Star Wars, there's a little bit of an example in the animated series called Star Wars Rebels. And Jedi Master Kanan Jarrus is sitting down with his apprentice, Ezra Bridger. Ezra is very much afraid. He doesn't know if he's going to be a great Jedi. It's kind of a childish storyline, but Kanan sits him down and he asks him to say, what are you really afraid of? Tell me what you are actually afraid of. And it actually goes back to his childhood. He was like, I'm afraid of being left again. I'm afraid, like, if I go down the path of Jedi, I'm going to not have a family. I'm going to lose my friends. If I fight the Empire, you could die. Like, I'm afraid of being alone. So he has to, like, say all of these things to get through all these things that are bothering him. And then you realize it after you say these things, you acknowledge it. You're like, oh, I don't want to be alone. I need people around me. And I just think that is very true to how you can really get underneath your own layers of what's really making you afraid and what's really making you nervous. So I ask people at the end of the book to focus on letting go a little bit and acknowledge and name your fear. And if you can't figure out what's making you afraid, go through a list, name all of the things, and then I think you'll find out what is the real thing that's causing you discomfort.
That's really interesting. And I want to touch on something too that you mentioned just a minute ago, which is you are obviously not making this a partisan book. You're not making it a weapon. You do hope that it will leave people with a little bit of perspective on their politics and on the role of government. So maybe you could talk about the storylines and systems of government. I find this part really fascinating. You know, the Senate and Palpatine and how government evolves through the Star Wars plotline and what people should take away from that about systems of power.
Yeah. So one of the things that I say a lot of times when I'm talking about the politics of Star Wars is that George Lucas, in the prequel trilogy, he was showing us a story of how democracies fall and empires can rise. And he always would say in the interviews promoting the prequel films, he would say, look, democracies aren't conquered by foreign powers. They're given away by a willing people. The popular line at the end of episode 3 is when Padme is watching the Senate applaud the rise of Palpatine when he claims the mantle of emperor. And she says, so this is how democracy dies, with thunderous applause. I certainly think that's true. And I think it is true because George Lucas is giving us in the main character of Anakin Skywalker who he thinks you are and who he is, which is someone who's frustrated with democracy. Democracy kind of sucks sometimes. It's imperfect. It's slow. It's grinding. It is unfulfilling. It requires compromise. Like nothing is ever going to be perfect. George Lucas himself admitted in a Time interview in 1999 that his preferred government would be an enlightened dictatorship. He has said this.
Right.
And I think that's honest. And I think it's valuable because a lot of us would prefer to create in a test tube the enlightened leader who really does believe the right things. I'd like to make Justin Amash king because I think he's a good guy and I think he understands the world. And so Anakin is talking to Padme on Naboo in episode 2. They're bickering about her job. He doesn't like politics, again, because George Lucas doesn't like politics, and he projects that into Anakin. And she's like, we do all these things in the Senate. And Anakin's like, well, what's my preferred form of government would be where the people have representatives and they sit down and they discuss what's in the best interest of the people. And then they make a decision and they do it. and she's like, that's what we do. The problem is that people don't always agree. Anakin looks at her and he says, well, then they should be made to. And she says, well, who's going to make them? You? And he says, well, no, not me, but someone wise. And for me, and he laughs, right? Like he kind of like snickers, like he's trolling when he says that, but he's not. If there's anything that I have learned from the past 4 years, but even just January 6th, right? Like one of the lessons of that, you should not assume that your neighbors and your political aligned friends actually would prefer democracy over something else. I really think it's actually a little bit unnatural. Like, look at the course of human history, thousands of years of civilization. Democracy is a new invention. It is a relatively young invention. So that's my long way of saying I think that Star Wars is aware that democracy is hard, and it doesn't do a very good job of selling why it's actually good.
Right. Who knows? Maybe they would have had built into the Senate a constitutional restriction on what Palpatine could do. I don't know, but I guess he would have had to take notes from Justin Amash to write that film that way.
Our enlightened, benevolent despot.
But the thing is, though, if we made Justin Amash king and he accepted that, he'd no longer be Justin Amash.
He would no longer be Justin Amash, and we would not like him very much.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, and I actually haven't seen all the latest movies, so this is just kind of more me asking. Has Star Wars gone really woke in the recent movies, and does it take away from the films, or do you still think they're just as valuable as the ones that came before?
My answer to that is no, and I want to qualify this because this is a very contentious subject among partisans. I consider myself a conservative libertarian. I watch these movies all the time, and I guess the main critique of the newest films, J.J. Abrams and then Rian Johnson's The Last Jedi, was that it was some sort of like feminist screed, that it put down Luke Skywalker as, you know, being a jaded, old, broken hero so that it could elevate a Mary Sue type character. I guess I've just never really understood this, just because like Star Wars 1977 is based around these flyboy heroes going to the Death Star to save Princess Leia, and then it turns out she doesn't really need saving, and she just insults them the entire time. And she's like, yeah, like some rescue. I didn't need whatever you guys have. Like Leia has kind of been like kicking the butts of the main heroes for the entire run of Star Wars. So that just like never made a lot of sense to me as like a new critique. What I do think that the new films struggle with a little bit is trying to offer meta commentary about the fandom and about the state of the world. But I don't view that as wokeism. There's a scene in The Last Jedi where one of the main characters, Rose Tico, is watching a horse race kind of deal. They're on like this very wealthy casino type planet where millionaires and billionaires are.
I remember this scene. I've seen that one.
Right. And so they're like observing animal cruelty and they don't like it. They're like, oh, this is bad. I don't like this horse racing kind of deal. And they also look at the millionaires and billionaires in the casino, and they like call them like the worst people in the galaxy. And these people, it turns out, are like arms dealers. They are invested in war between the Sith and the Jedi, the Republic and the First Order. Like the war machine is the thing that's tearing up the entire galaxy. And Ben Shapiro took to his show the next week and like basically bashed the idea that like the movie was like pro like animal rights and that it critiqued slavery, which I thought was really weird. I don't know if you saw Solo, a Star Wars story, the Han Solo prequel, but there was a self-aware droid in that movie who was no longer restrained and going along with her programming, and she led a droid rebellion. Because the droids are sentient. They actually have thoughts and they have feelings. We've known this since the 70s and the 80s when the original Star Wars came out, because they have these things on them called restraining bolts. And that's in the original Star Wars. What is it restraining? It's restraining their will. So this one droid is a revolutionary. And like Ben Shapiro like took that and like ran it off as being like wokeism. And I was like, it's against slavery. Like they are enslaving droids and having them do a thing without free will. I just think that we are at this moment where we're being very petty and childish about social themes in movies, and being able to talk about them in an intellectually honest way.
So 30-second pitch for listeners why they should pause this, go down to the description and click pre-order.
Because we have so few things in our lives these days that are untainted and shared and also uplifting. Star Wars remains a story that transcends multiple generations, telling us a story about how you can grow up to be a better person, make the world a better place, and you should also curb your appetites and live a more virtuous life. So if you want to learn more about how Star Wars can help you live more empathetically, with more humility, less fear, some hope, I think that this is the book for you. So I hope you'll pick up How the Force Can Fix the World.
Yeah, everybody go check it out in the link in the description. But now for the most important part of the show, the reason that people stick around past the serious conversation, the food take. Steven, hit us with your most controversial one.
I think it is acceptable and delicious to make yourself a ketchup sandwich if you are running low on peanut butter and jelly. 2 nice slices of bread, Heinz ketchup, not Hunt's. Hunt's is way too sweet. Slap those 2 pieces of bread together, some ketchup, and enjoy.
That's it?
That's it.
That sounds really gross.
Nah, it's nourishing. It'll take the edge off if you're feeling hungry.
Bread and salt.
If you're feeling a little hangry, I recommend the ketchup sandwich. It's not going to hurt you, and who doesn't like bread or ketchup?
All right, there you go. That's quite the hot food take. Steven, thanks so much for coming on.
Brad, it was a pleasure. Thank you.